What if we told you that the first fully electronic movie soundtrack ever made came shaped like a hexagon, that a monkey suffocated on camera with a scuba diving assistant director standing by for rescue, and that Michael Crichton himself appears in the film while towering over the cast at 6 feet 9 inches? From a Texas ghost town with only 20 residents to revolutionary special effects created with cardboard and conventional cameras, this sci-fi thriller holds secrets that are almost as strange as the alien organism at its center. Fact 1. Hexagonal vinyl history. When the Andromeda strain hit theaters in 1971, audiences weren't just amazed by the groundbreaking science fiction story, they were also witnessing the birth of something completely unprecedented in film music. The movie's soundtrack, composed by Gil Mellé, became the very first all-electronic score ever created for a major motion picture, and the record company decided this revolutionary music deserved equally revolutionary packaging. Instead of releasing the soundtrack on a standard round vinyl record like every other album at the time, they made something that had never been seen before, a 10-inch hexagonal record that looked more like a piece of alien technology than a music album. The unusual six-sided shape wasn't just for show, it was designed to reflect the geometric, crystalline structure of the deadly Andromeda organism from the movie itself. But the weirdness didn't stop with the record's shape. The packaging was just as extraordinary, featuring a camera shutter-style cover that opened like the aperture of a lens. When you purchased the album, you'd receive what looked like a standard 12-inch square album cover. But attached to the front was a special housing designed by graphic artist Virginia Clark, with help from sculptor Joel Shapiro. This housing held the hexagonal record inside and functioned exactly like a camera shutter, opening in segments to reveal the unusual vinyl inside. The entire project was incredibly expensive to produce. According to industry reports, the packaging alone cost more than twice the gross profit of the album, making it one of the most elaborate and costly record presentations in music history. Only 10,000 copies of the original hexagonal version were ever made, and they sold out quickly among collectors fascinated by both the groundbreaking electronic music and the unprecedented packaging design. When the record company wanted to do a second pressing, they decided the special packaging was too expensive and released the music on a standard round 12-inch record instead. However, this conventional version didn't sell nearly as well, proving that the unique hexagonal presentation was a crucial part of the album's appeal. Fact 2. Scuba rescue mission. One of the most disturbing scenes in the Andromeda strain shows a laboratory monkey apparently dying when exposed to the deadly alien organism, and for decades, viewers have wondered whether they were watching real animal cruelty on screen. The truth behind this scene reveals an elaborate safety operation that sounds more like an underwater rescue mission than a movie production. The filmmakers needed to show the lethal effects of the Andromeda organism in a way that would genuinely frighten audiences, so they decided to film real animals being exposed to a dangerous environment. However, director Robert Wise was determined to ensure no animals were actually harmed during filming. Working with Dr. M.W. Blackmore, the chief veterinarian at the University of Southern California, the production team devised a complex but safe procedure. The laboratory set was divided into two areas: safe zones filled with normal air where the human actors worked, and contaminated hot rooms that were sealed completely airtight and then filled with carbon dioxide gas. The animals were placed in small, airtight cages that contained pure oxygen, and these cages would be lowered into the carbon dioxide-filled rooms using mechanical arms. Here's where assistant director James Fargo comes into the story. Throughout the entire filming process, Fargo stood just outside the camera frame, wearing full scuba diving equipment and holding a secondary oxygen supply. The moment the cage door opened and the animal was exposed to the carbon dioxide, it would lose consciousness within just a few seconds from the lack of oxygen. The rescue operation had to happen incredibly fast. As soon as the monkey went limp, Fargo would immediately rush into the scene, grab the unconscious animal, and carry it out of the carbon dioxide-filled area while administering oxygen through his backup supply. The entire crew was amazed by how quickly the animals would recover once they received fresh oxygen again. The American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was present during every single take to monitor the animal's safety, and they officially approved the entire procedure. However, the rescue operation worked almost too well. If you watch the scene carefully, you can actually see Fargo's shadow moving toward the monkey just as it loses consciousness, because there was only one take, and the shadow couldn't be edited out. Fact 3. Michael Crichton's giant cameo. If you know where to look during the Andromeda strain, you can spot one of the most unusual author cameos in movie history, featuring a man who literally towers over everyone else in the scene. Michael Crichton, who wrote the original novel that the film was based on, appears as a bearded surgeon in the early hospital sequence where Dr. Mark Hall is suddenly pulled away from an operation to join the emergency wildfire team. At 6 feet 9 inches tall, Crichton was an absolutely unmistakable presence on any movie set, and his height made him stand out dramatically against the other actors and crew members. During the 1970s, when the film was made, it was still relatively uncommon for authors to make cameo appearances in adaptations of their work, but Crichton had a unique background that made his presence on set particularly fitting. Before becoming one of the world's most successful thriller writers, Crichton had actually trained as a medical doctor at Harvard Medical School, so appearing as a surgeon wasn't much of a stretch for him. He had graduated from medical school in 1969, just 2 years before the Andromeda strain was filmed, which meant he was still very familiar with hospital environments and medical procedures. In the cameo scene, Crichton appears sitting behind glass, wearing full surgical scrubs and a distinctive beard, observing as government officials interrupt Dr. Hall's surgery to recruit him for the secret wildfire project. The scene takes place in what's supposed to be a busy teaching hospital, and Crichton blends in naturally with the other medical professionals, except for his extraordinary height, which makes him immediately noticeable to anyone who knows to look for him. What makes this cameo even more interesting is that it represents a brief moment where the real-life creator of the Andromeda strain story appears within his own fictional world. Crichton was invited to tour Universal Studios during the production, and director Robert Wise apparently decided that having the author appear as a medical professional would add an authentic touch to the hospital scenes. The cameo is what movie buffs call a blink-and-you'll-miss-it moment, lasting only a few seconds, but Crichton's unmistakable height and distinctive bearded appearance make him easy to spot once you know he's there. Fact 4. Ghost town population 20. When the filmmakers needed to find a location that could convincingly portray a small town wiped out by a deadly alien organism, they discovered the perfect spot in one of the most remote corners of Texas. The fictional town of Piedmont, New Mexico, where the satellite crashes and kills nearly everyone in the Andromeda strain, was actually filmed in Shafter, Texas, a real place that was already well on its way to becoming a ghost town. In 1971, when director Robert Wise and his crew arrived to film the movie, Shafter had a total population of just 20 people. This tiny number made it ideal for the production because the filmmakers needed a location that would look authentically desolate and abandoned after the alien contamination, and Shafter required very little work to achieve that eerie, empty atmosphere. Shafter sits in Presidio County in far west Texas, about 40 miles south of Marfa and 19 miles north of Presidio, right along Highway 67. The town had once been a thriving silver mining community with a population that peaked at around 4,000 people back in 1940. But by the time the movie crew arrived, decades of economic decline had left it nearly deserted. The production team spent 3 weeks in February of 1970 transforming what little remained of Shafter to match their vision of the doomed town of Piedmont. They gave several buildings a facelift and rearranged some of the structures to create the specific look they needed for the scenes where scientists in hazmat suits investigate the mysterious deaths. What makes this location choice even more remarkable is that Shafter has continued to shrink in the decades since the movie was filmed. Today, the town's population has dropped to as few as 11 residents according to some counts, making it even more of a genuine ghost town than it was when the Andromeda strain was made. The most recognizable building from the movie, a small white church that appears prominently in several scenes, is still standing today and looks almost exactly the same as it did in 1971. Movie fans and curious travelers occasionally make the trek to this remote corner of Texas to see the building where Hollywood once imagined the end of the world beginning, though they're likely to encounter more tumbleweeds than people during their visit. Fact 5. First electronic film score. Long before synthesizers became a standard part of movie soundtracks in the 1980s and 90s, composer Gil Mellé made history by creating the very first all-electronic score for a major Hollywood feature film with the Andromeda strain. This groundbreaking decision wasn't just an artistic choice, it was a perfect match for a movie about alien life forms and high-tech scientific laboratories. In 1971, electronic music was still considered extremely experimental and was mostly confined to avant-garde concerts and academic settings. Most movie composers were still working with traditional orchestras using instruments like violins, horns, and pianos to create their scores. The idea of replacing an entire orchestra with electronic synthesizers and sound generators was virtually unheard of in mainstream filmmaking. Mellé, who was already known as a jazz saxophonist and innovative composer, saw the Andromeda strain as an opportunity to create something completely new. He believed that the cold, alien nature of the story demanded sounds that no traditional orchestra could produce, so he assembled an array of electronic equipment that was cutting edge for its time, including primitive synthesizers and custom-built sound generation devices. The composer spent months experimenting with different electronic textures and sounds, creating eerie tones that seemed to pulse and breathe like living organisms. His main theme, called Wildfire, opens with what sounds like an electronic heartbeat, backed by computerized beeps and a rhythmic hammering noise, then transforms into discordant wailing sounds that perfectly capture the unsettling atmosphere of the underground laboratory. What made Mellé's work even more remarkable was that he was essentially inventing the techniques as he went along, since there were no established methods for creating a full-length electronic film score. He had to figure out how to make his synthetic sounds work with the pacing and emotional needs of each scene, something that traditional composers had centuries of orchestral tradition to guide them through. The electronic score was so unusual that many audience members weren't sure what to make of it when the film was first released. However, Mellé's pioneering work would eventually influence countless composers, and by the late 1970s and early 80s, electronic film scores would become much more common, especially in science fiction movies. Fact 6. 3D lab created with cardboard. One of the most impressive visual effects in the Andromeda strain shows a detailed three-dimensional computer diagram of the underground wildfire laboratory, with each level of the facility rotating and moving in perfect synchronization to give viewers a complete understanding of the complex structure. What audiences saw on screen looked like cutting-edge computer graphics, but the reality behind this effect reveals an ingenious, low-tech solution that would make any modern visual effects artist smile. In 1971, the kind of computer-generated imagery that we take for granted today simply didn't exist. There were no digital animation programs, no three-dimensional modeling software, and certainly no way for computers to create the kind of detailed architectural visualization that the filmmakers wanted to show. So, visual effects supervisor Douglas Trumbull, who had already amazed audiences with his work on 2001, A Space Odyssey, had to come up with a completely analog solution. The process began with creating detailed drawings of each individual level of the Wildfire Laboratory, showing the layout of rooms, corridors, and equipment on every floor. These drawings were then carefully projected onto pieces of cardboard, one level at a time, using standard film projectors. The cardboard acted as a screen, allowing the projected images to be captured by the camera. Here's where the magic happened. Instead of filming these projections as static images, Trumbull's team slowly moved each piece of cardboard while simultaneously rolling the camera at a carefully controlled speed. This created what's called a transparent exposure, where the moving cardboard allowed some light to pass through while creating ghostly, semi-visible images of each laboratory level. The final step involved layering multiple exposures on top of each other, with each piece of film containing the transparent image of a different floor of the facility. When all these separate exposures were combined, they created the illusion of a complete three-dimensional structure that appeared to rotate and move in space, with each level visible through the others. The entire effect was accomplished using nothing more than cardboard, projectors, and careful camera work. Yet it looked so convincing that many viewers assumed they were seeing some kind of advanced computer simulation. This technique required incredible precision and timing, since there was no way to preview the results until the film was developed and processed. Fact 7. Douglas Trumbull's costly mistake. When Douglas Trumbull was approached to create the visual effects for the Andromeda strain, he was riding high on his success from working on Stanley Kubrick's 2001, A Space Odyssey, where he had helped create some of the most groundbreaking special effects in cinema history. However, his transition from working as part of Kubrick's team to running his own independent effects company taught him a harsh lesson about the business side of Hollywood that nearly destroyed his career before it really began. After returning to Hollywood from working on 2001 in England, Trumbull had set up his own visual effects company and was eager to prove himself as an independent contractor. When the opportunity came to bid on the Andromeda strain, he was so focused on getting the job and demonstrating his abilities that he made a critical error in calculating his costs. As Trumbull later admitted in interviews, he was still a young guy who was very naive about the financial realities of running a special effects business. He had spent years working within the structured environment of major studio productions, where budgets and costs were handled by other people, and he had never had to figure out the true price of creating complex visual effects from scratch. When it came time to submit his bid for the Andromeda strain, Trumbull seriously underbid the job, offering to do the work for far less money than it would actually cost to complete. He later confessed that he had no idea what these kinds of effects were supposed to cost, since there was no established industry standard for the type of work he was proposing to do. The result was a financial disaster that nearly ended his career before it had properly started. As the production progressed and the true costs of creating dozens of complex shots became clear, including the electron microscope imagery of the Andromeda organism and various computer readouts, Trumbull found himself spending far more money than he was being paid. He was forced to cover the difference out of his own pocket, and the project nearly drove him into bankruptcy. Despite this financial catastrophe, Trumbull's work on the Andromeda strain was exceptional, and both author Michael Crichton and director Robert Wise were extremely impressed with the results. This professional recognition helped establish his reputation and eventually led to more lucrative projects, but the experience taught him valuable lessons about properly pricing his services in the competitive world of Hollywood visual effects. Fact 8. Gender-flipped scientist. One of the most important characters in the Andromeda strain almost didn't exist as audiences know her today, because the brilliant and feisty scientist Dr. Ruth Leavitt was originally written as a completely different person in Michael Crichton's novel. In the original book, this character was Dr. Peter Levitt, a male microbiologist who served the same scientific function but brought none of the complexity and tension that the female version would eventually add to the story. The change from male to female happened during the screenplay adaptation process when screenwriter Nelson Gidding approached director Robert Wise with the suggestion that they transform one of the male scientists into a woman. Gidding believed that having an all-male team of scientists would make the movie feel outdated and unrealistic, especially since women were already making significant contributions to scientific research in the real world by 1971. However, director Wise was initially resistant to this idea, and his concerns reveal some interesting attitudes about female characters in science fiction movies at the time. Wise worried that adding a woman to the cast would turn Dr. Levitt into what he called a largely decorative character, similar to Raquel Welch's role in the 1966 film Fantastic Voyage, where her character seemed to exist primarily for visual appeal rather than scientific expertise. Gidding had to work hard to convince Wise that his vision for Dr. Ruth Levitt was completely different from the typical Hollywood approach to female scientists. The screenwriter explained that he wanted to create a serious, accomplished researcher who would drive the plot forward through her own scientific knowledge and decision-making, rather than serving as romantic interest or eye candy for the male characters. To help make his case, Wise decided to consult with actual scientists about the idea of including a female microbiologist on the team. When he asked for their opinions, the scientists were unanimously enthusiastic about the change, telling him that having women in important research positions was already common in real laboratories and would make the movie more authentic rather than less realistic. After hearing these expert opinions, Wise changed his mind completely about the character modification. By the time filming was completed, he was so pleased with actress Kate Reid's performance as Dr. Ruth Levitt that he declared her the most interesting character in the entire movie, proving that Gidding's instincts about the potential of this gender-flipped scientist had been absolutely correct. Fact 9. Unknown star cast by design. When Universal Pictures allocated $6.5 million for the Andromeda strain, it was considered a substantial budget for 1971, signaling that the studio expected big things from this science fiction thriller. However, in a decision that surprised many people in Hollywood, director Robert Wise made the deliberate choice to cast the film almost entirely with actors who weren't household names, even though he could have afforded major stars with that kind of money. Wise's reasoning behind this unusual casting strategy was both practical and artistic, stemming from his belief that famous faces would actually hurt the movie rather than help it. He was determined to create a film that felt like a realistic documentary about a scientific crisis, and he worried that putting recognizable movie stars in the lead roles would constantly remind audiences that they were watching a Hollywood production rather than witnessing actual events. The four main scientists were played by Arthur Hill, James Olsen, David Wayne, and Kate Reid, all of whom were respected character actors with solid theatrical backgrounds, but relatively little film experience. Arthur Hill, who played the team leader Dr. Jeremy Stone, had appeared in only a handful of movies before the Andromeda strain, and James Olsen, who portrayed the young surgeon Dr. Mark Hall, was even less known to film audiences. What made this casting approach even more interesting was that Wise specifically wanted actors who looked like real scientists, rather than typical movie heroes. He assembled what he later described as a cast of fine actors who just didn't happen to be household names, believing that their ordinary appearances would make the high-tech laboratory sequences and scientific procedures seem more authentic and believable. The strategy created an unusual situation where the most famous person in the entire movie was actually George Mitchell, who played the old man who survives the alien contamination. Mitchell had built a long career in supporting roles in major films like 3:10 to Yuma Birdman of Alcatraz, and the unsinkable Molly Brown, making him ironically more recognizable to audiences than any of the supposed lead actors. This casting philosophy reflected Wise's overall approach to the film, where he wanted the elaborate wildfire laboratory sets and cutting-edge special effects to be the real stars of the movie. By using unknown actors, he ensured that audiences would focus their attention on the scientific mystery and high-tech equipment rather than being distracted by celebrity personalities. Fact 10. One-take monkey shadow. If you watch the Andromeda strain very carefully during the disturbing laboratory scene, where a monkey appears to die from exposure to the alien organism, you can spot an unintended piece of movie magic that reveals exactly how the filmmakers kept their animal actors safe. Just as the monkey goes limp and appears to lose consciousness, there's a brief shadow that moves across the scene, and that shadow belongs to assistant director James Fargo, rushing in to rescue the animal with his emergency oxygen supply. This shadow wasn't supposed to be visible in the final film, but it ended up becoming permanent evidence of the elaborate safety procedures that were put in place to protect the animals during filming. The rescue operation had been carefully planned and rehearsed, with Fargo positioned just outside the camera frame, wearing full scuba diving equipment and holding backup oxygen, ready to move the instant the animal showed signs of distress. The problem was that the safety measures worked almost too well, creating an unexpected challenge for the film editors. The moment the monkey's cage was opened and it was exposed to the carbon dioxide-filled environment, it lost consciousness within just a few seconds, exactly as planned. However, Fargo's response was so fast and his concern for the animal's welfare so immediate that he moved toward the unconscious monkey before the camera had stopped rolling. Since the entire sequence had been filmed as a single continuous take, there was no way to edit out Fargo's shadow without ruining the dramatic impact of the scene. The filmmakers faced a difficult choice. They could either reshoot the entire sequence and put another animal through the same stressful procedure, or they could accept that eagle-eyed viewers might notice the shadow and leave the scene as it was. Director Robert Wise ultimately decided to keep the take exactly as it was filmed, shadow and all, rather than subject another animal to the carbon dioxide exposure just for the sake of a technically perfect shot. This decision reflects the production's genuine commitment to animal welfare, even when it meant accepting a minor flaw in an otherwise powerful scene. The shadow lasts for only a fraction of a second, and most viewers never notice it during their first viewing of the movie. But film enthusiasts who know what to look for can spot this unintentional behind-the-scenes glimpse of James Fargo's quick-thinking animal rescue operation. Fact 11. Bachelor selection theory. One of the most unusual aspects of the Andromeda strain involves a bizarre scientific theory that determines which member of the research team gets the most important and dangerous job in the entire facility. Dr. Mark Hall is chosen to carry the only key that can shut down the laboratory's nuclear self-destruct mechanism, but his selection isn't based on his medical expertise, leadership skills, or experience with crisis situations. Instead, he's picked because he's a bachelor. This selection process is based on something called the odd man hypothesis, a fictional but surprisingly detailed theory that Michael Crichton created for his novel, and which the movie explains in matter-of-fact scientific terms. According to this hypothesis, extensive psychological testing had supposedly proven that unmarried males were more likely to make the right choice during a life-or-death crisis than people who were married or had families. The reasoning behind this theory was that single men would be the most dispassionate and objective members of any group, since they wouldn't have emotional attachments that might cloud their judgment when facing an impossible decision. The military planners who designed the wildfire facility believed that a married scientist might hesitate to trigger the nuclear device if it meant sacrificing his own life, because he would be thinking about his wife and children rather than focusing purely on preventing a global catastrophe. Dr. Hall is essentially chosen to be the person who would decide whether to let himself and his colleagues die in a nuclear explosion to prevent the Andromeda organism from escaping and potentially destroying all life on Earth. The other scientists refer to him as the odd man throughout the movie, and this designation carries enormous psychological weight, since everyone knows that Hall alone has the power to save or doom them all. What makes this concept even more interesting is that it reflects real 1970s attitudes about marriage, family responsibilities, and decision-making under pressure. The idea that bachelor status would make someone more rational and less emotional seems deeply questionable by today's standards, but it was presented in the film as established scientific fact. The odd man hypothesis also creates an additional layer of tension in the story, since it means that the fate of the entire team rests with the youngest and least experienced member of the group, chosen not for his wisdom or expertise, but simply because he happens to be unmarried. Fact 12. Wildfire's nuclear secret. The underground wildfire laboratory that serves as the main setting for most of the Andromeda strain wasn't just impressive on screen. It was also one of the most expensive and elaborate movie sets ever constructed at the time, costing Universal Pictures more than $300,000 to build in 1971. To put that figure in perspective, $300,000 in the early 70s would be equivalent to nearly $2 million today, making it an enormous investment for what was essentially a collection of interconnected rooms and corridors. Director Robert Wise was absolutely determined to make the wildfire facility look completely authentic and functional, rather than like a typical Hollywood movie set. He insisted that every piece of equipment visible on camera had to be real and operational, from the computer terminals with their unusual light pen interfaces to the electron microscopes that the scientists used to study the alien organism. This commitment to realism meant that the production team had to purchase or rent actual scientific instruments rather than building fake props that would look good but serve no real purpose. The set was designed by production designer Boris Levin, who created a 5-level underground complex that looked like it could actually function as a real biological research facility. Each level had its own distinct color coding and security measures, with increasingly strict decontamination procedures as the scientists moved deeper into the facility. The lowest level, where the most dangerous research took place, featured sterile white surfaces and airlocks that appeared completely functional. Industry publications at the time described the wildfire laboratory as one of the most elaborately detailed interiors ever built for a motion picture, and the attention to detail was extraordinary. Every computer console had working lights and displays. Every scientific instrument looked like it had been borrowed from an actual research facility, and the corridors and rooms were designed with the kind of practical functionality that real scientists would need. The set was so convincing that it became a major character in the movie itself, with the laboratory's sterile, high-tech environment contributing significantly to the film's atmosphere of scientific precision and mounting tension. The massive cost of construction was justified by the fact that the wildfire facility needed to look like a place where the fate of the world could realistically be decided, and the investment in authentic details helped make the entire story more believable. Fact 13. Split-screen innovation. The Andromeda strain pushed the boundaries of visual storytelling by using some of the most complex and innovative camera techniques available in 1971, creating scenes that required multiple projectors, screens, and optical effects running simultaneously to achieve the final result. Cinematographer Richard Klein developed techniques that were so advanced for their time that they wouldn't become common in Hollywood until years later, when digital technology made similar effects much easier to accomplish. One of the most impressive techniques used throughout the film was the split-field diopter, which allowed the camera to keep both foreground and background objects in sharp focus, even when they were at completely different distances from the lens. This created scenes where scientists could be working in the immediate foreground, while detailed laboratory equipment and computer screens remained perfectly clear in the background, giving audiences a complete view of the complex scientific environment without losing any important visual information. The film also made extensive use of traditional split-screen techniques, but took them to unprecedented levels of complexity by incorporating multiple rear projections within the same shot. Some of the most technically challenging scenes involved up to 4 different rear projections happening at the same time, using 2 separate process projectors and 2 stereo slide projectors that were all carefully synchronized to project images onto 2 different screens within the same camera frame. These elaborate projection setups were necessary to show the scientists' work with microscopic images and computer data, since the story required audiences to see both the researchers and the results of their experiments simultaneously. Douglas Trumbull's microscopic photography of the Andromeda organism was rear projected onto laboratory viewing screens, while other projectors displayed computer readouts and scientific data on additional monitors, all within the same shot. The technical challenges were enormous, since every projector had to be perfectly balanced in terms of light intensity and color temperature to match the ambient lighting on the laboratory sets. The crew had to use various filters and scrims to reduce the brightness of the projected images without affecting their sharpness, creating a consistent visual environment where all the different light sources looked natural together. This level of technical complexity meant that many scenes required extensive preparation and multiple takes to achieve the right balance of lighting, timing, and focus across all the different visual elements, making The Andromeda Strain one of the most technically ambitious films of its era. Fact 14. Day for Night Desert Deception. The opening scenes of The Andromeda Strain take place in the desert at night, showing 2 Air Force technicians discovering the deadly aftermath of the crashed satellite in the small town of Piedmont. But what audiences see as a dark, ominous nighttime landscape was actually filmed in broad daylight, using an incredibly complex photographic process that was cutting edge for 1971. The filmmakers chose to shoot during the day because the desert area around Shafter, Texas was simply too large and remote to light artificially for night filming. The problem they faced was that the brilliant blue Texas sky looked completely wrong when the film was processed to appear darker, creating scenes that looked obviously artificial and unconvincing. Even after the footage was printed down to simulate nighttime conditions, the desert sky remained a bright, vibrant blue that immediately gave away the fact that the scenes had been shot during daylight hours. Cinematographer Richard Klein worked with the laboratory technicians at Technicolor to develop a solution that had originally been created by Deluxe General Labs, but had rarely been used on such a large scale. The process involved creating a panchromatic black and white duplicate of every desert scene, which essentially captured all the same visual information, but without any color data. The magic happened when these black and white duplicates were used as masks during the final printing process. The color-positive footage and the panchromatic black and white duplicate were printed together, with the black and white version acting as a filter that selectively desaturated different parts of the image. This technique allowed the laboratory to substitute varying shades of gray for the full-strength colors in specific areas of the frame, particularly the problematic bright blue sky. The result was a desert landscape that looked convincingly dark and foreboding, with a properly muted sky that suggested nighttime conditions without the artificial appearance that would have resulted from simple color correction. This process required incredible precision and timing, since the black and white masks had to be perfectly aligned with the color footage to avoid creating visual distortions or mismatched areas. The technique was so successful that most viewers never realized they were looking at day-for-night footage, and the desert scenes maintain their eerie, threatening atmosphere even when watched on modern high-definition displays that might reveal flaws in less sophisticated optical effects. Fact 15. Medical accuracy recognition. More than 30 years after the Andromeda strain was first released, the medical and scientific community gave the film an extraordinary honor that no other movie in the killer virus genre has ever received. In 2003, the Infectious Diseases Society of America published an official recognition declaring the Andromeda strain to be the most significant, scientifically accurate, and prototypic of all films. In the entire category of deadly pathogen movies, this wasn't just a casual compliment from entertainment-minded doctors. It was a formal acknowledgement from one of the most respected medical organizations in the world, representing thousands of physicians and researchers who specialize in exactly the kind of biological threats that the movie depicts. The Society specifically praised the film for its realistic portrayal of how medical professionals would actually respond to an unknown and potentially catastrophic infectious agent. The medical experts were particularly impressed by the movie's accurate depiction of containment procedures, noting that the film correctly showed the appearance of a deadly biological agent, realistically portrayed its impact on human victims, and demonstrated proper scientific methods for containing and studying such an organism. They also praised the movie's realistic presentation of the scientific process used to identify the pathogen and determine why certain individuals might be immune to its effects. What made this recognition even more remarkable was that it came after decades of other virus-themed movies that had taken far more dramatic liberties with medical science. Films like Outbreak, Contagion, and various zombie movies had all tackled similar themes, but none of them earned the same level of professional respect from actual infectious disease specialists. The Society's praise extended beyond just the basic scientific accuracy to include the film's realistic portrayal of how government agencies, military organizations, and research institutions would coordinate their response to a biological emergency. The movie's depiction of interagency communication, emergency protocols, and scientific decision-making under extreme pressure all reflected real-world procedures that medical professionals recognized as authentic. This professional recognition helps explain why the Andromeda strain has remained relevant and respected long after its initial release, and why medical schools and public health programs sometimes use clips from the film to illustrate proper containment procedures and scientific methodology. The movie's commitment to realism, which began with Michael Crichton's extensive medical research and continued through Robert Wise's insistence on authentic laboratory equipment, ultimately created a work of science fiction that real scientists could genuinely respect.